The United Nations General Assembly roundly condemns the blockade on Cuba with 187 votes to 3. Chile's major unions call for a general strike as anti-neoliberal protests continue. And Barbados' Prime Minister Mia Mottley calls for Caribbean cooperation for regional airline Liat. Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Doris Polo in Quito, and this is From the South. We begin with news from the United Nations. The 28th plenary session of the General Assembly has voted to overwhelmingly reject the economic, financial and commercial blockade on Cuba. The resolution passed with 187 in favor, 3 against and 2 abstentions. The United States, Israel and Brazil voted against. Colombia and Ukraine abstained. The resolution condemned the United States' application of the Helms-Burton Act on Cuba. It expressed the need to respect the sovereignty of states and supported non-interventionist policies as laid down in the United Nations Charter. The Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez closed the debate with a detailed account of the impact of almost 6 decades of blockade on Cuba and the world. He began by condemning the U.S. government's recent tightening of these illegal measures.
During the last few months, President Donald Trump's administration has started to escalate aggression against Cuba through the implementation of non-conventional measures to prevent the arrival of fuel shipments to our country from different markets by resorting to sanctions and threats against vessels, shipping companies and insurance companies. The intent, apart from damaging Cuba's economy, is to harm the living standards of Cuban families. The United States government is responsible for announcing its decision in April this year to allow lawsuits to be filed before U.S. courts against Cuban and foreign entities under Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. Persecution of our banking and financial relations with the rest of the world has continued to intensify. Remittances sent to Cuban citizens have been restricted. The granting of visas has been reduced. Consular services have been limited. The agreement achieved between the baseball federations of both countries has been cancelled. Individual travel by American citizens has been stopped. Cruise ships travels as well as direct flights to Cuban airports, except for Havana's airport, were prohibited.
After explaining the inhuman consequences of restricting Cuba's access to drugs for cancer and other diseases, the Cuban foreign minister said the United States does not have the slightest moral authority to criticize Cuba or any other country over human rights.
In the world's richest country, 40 million Americans live in poverty. Of them, 18.5 million live in extreme poverty. At the end of last year, 25.7% of people with disabilities lived in poverty. More than 500,000 are homeless. Article 23, the right to work. In late 2018, there were 6.6 million unemployed in the United States. Article 25, the right to health. 28.5 million U.S. citizens lack health insurance, and millions of the lowest income persons will be left without it.
The Venezuelan foreign minister, Jorge Arreaza, was one of the first to speak at today's session. He condemned the blockade on Cuba, endorsed multilateralism, and called for an end to all unilateral measures imposed in contravention of international law. Let's listen.
The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is glad that this plenary meeting has been convened to address an issue to which my delegation attaches particular importance, namely the necessity of ending the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed by the United States against Cuba. the fact that a high-level delegation has been sent, headed by the Minister for Foreign Affairs, reflects the importance which the President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro Moros, attaches to this debate and the vote on this fair and legitimate resolution. We are here to be supporters of Cuba at a time when the government of the United States has tightened the criminal blockade imposed for almost 60 years. We are also here at a time of global turbulence to highlight the relevance that all member states must attach to strengthening multilateralism and respect for the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. And we call for an end to all unilateral coercive measures imposed in violation of international law.
Areaza implored the United Nations to act in order to protect its own charter, quoting Cuban poet Jose Marti, saying that actions are better than words.
We call for specific action to put an end to these inhumane policies which trample on the very spirit and body of the Charter of the United Nations, which are an aggression and affront to the United Nations. So that this organization can achieve its noble goals, as Jose Marti said. Action is better than words. Now we must act. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is a responsible member of the international community, and we will vote once again in support of Resolution A74L6 on the necessity to end the blockade against Cuba, and we call on the United States, once the resolution has been adopted, to comply with the provisions of this resolution and the undeniable principles as proved by the General Assembly.
And St. Kitts and Nevis's representative said that the blockade is causing economic hardships for ordinary Cubans and is an impediment to the country's efforts to reach its sustainable development goals.
St. Kitts and Nevis, in its contribution to the Secretary General's report on this matter, expressed disappointment in measures now sought to intensify the economic aggression against Cuba and reiterates its unequivocal opposition to the continuance of this unjust embargo, which continues to cause widespread economic hardship for the people of Cuba. Cuba is a close ally of St. Kitts and Nevis and has aided in the economic and social development of St. Kitts and Nevis, especially in areas of.
Meanwhile, citing the negative extraterritorial impact of the blockade, Antigua and Barbuda's UN representative called for an end to the coercive measure imposed by the U.S.
Antigua and Barbuda consider Cuba as a legitimate member of our Western Hemisphere community and as a member of the Caribbean community family of nations. We call on the United States to cease the embargo, which has gone on far too long and has no useful purpose. We once again call on the United States and the government of Cuba to meet and find peaceful ways to bring about a relationship based on mutual respect and shared responsibility between the people of both neighboring nations.
Coming up after the break, we'll hear from the Bolivian vice president who warns of a wave of fascism in the country. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. In Latin America, Chile's major trade unions are calling for a general strike next Tuesday, November 12th. Leaders of the dockers, shop workers and miners unions, all members of the CUT Federation, criticized the human rights violations committed by the forces of repression propping up the government of Sebastián Piñera. They called for popular unity and reiterated the demand for a constituent assembly to create a new national constitution.
It's going to be an historic day. The solidarity between workers is clear. We've been together mobilizing, and we have to come together as a society, beyond just as workers. We call on everyone to join us. Together we can work for the changes that the country needs.
We are an organization that counts on more than 40,000 members and more than 100 unions. We are with the Code Federation. Unity is important to us above all. We call on the commercial sector and financial services not to wake that day.
We want to be clear that any talks, with whomever they may be, must stem from a basic respect for human rights. Human rights continue to be trampled on. Our kids are being shot while at school. This is something that needs to be addressed through a commission of justice and truth. We need to take control of the situation in the country. With respect to what we've spoken about and what we're in agreement on, a constituent assembly being called for by the people is a call coming from our communities, from our homes.
Protests against the neoliberal administration and entrenched inequality in Chile have entered their third week. Doctors and nurses joined social organizations are marching on the World Health Organization building in the capital, Santiago. Earlier in the day, they confronted the health minister at Salvador Hospital in the capital, Santiago. And on Wednesday, Chilean personalities from various societal sectors presented a number of official complaints in the country's courts to denounce police spying and violent repression against citizens, in particular against the youth.
Representatives from various sectors, including academia, labor union, social movements, and independent media, have condemned that there is a secret police currently operating against citizens in the style of the Pinochet dictatorship.
We have presented a criminal complaint against the head of the Special Police Force and the Interior Minister because we have been subjected to espionage. Such practices remind us of the times of the dictatorship, a memory that seems to be recurring.
We have collected enough testimonies to prove that the state intelligence agents are violating our human rights. It's unbelievable that our people are having to suffer through such events yet again.
Just this week, security forces opened fire inside an all-girls high school, wounding a number of students. There's also been complaints of kidnappings of civilians by people driving cars with police plates.
When they fire at students inside a high school, when they harass children and teenagers, when the mayor of Santiago decides to cancel the school year in a number of public schools, we can clearly see this is a systematic attack against our youth. I want to denounce this criminal government, and I want to tell Sebastián Piñera that since he decided to walk down this road, his only way out is to resign. The blood of so many is in his hands. He is at fault for so many human rights violations and for attacking and criminalizing our youth.
As the complaint was being filed, the student was being released by the courts after being arbitrarily arrested. There are thousands of cases like this.
A van full of special police stopped me and they arrested me. I hadn't done anything. Me and my friends were just coming back from lunch. During the struggle, they threw me to the ground. And that's why I have these wounds.
In the last 19 days, the National Institute for Human Rights has presented almost as many complaints of human rights abuses as it had since its creation.
Moving north, the Colombian Defense Minister Guillermo Botero has resigned. The minister announced he was stepping down after it emerged that he had overseen an operation against dissident FARC guerrillas that killed 8 children and adolescents. The bombing of the supposed guerrillas took place in August, and the minister claimed it as a success. But the truth came out as Botero was summoned to Congress to account for other human rights violations. On to Bolivia, where demonstrators gathered outside Congress in response to acts of violence and racism by opposition sectors. Women demanded justice after the town hall in Binto was burned down and Mayor Patricia Arce was violently attacked. Protesters cut her hair and threw red paint at her. She was later rescued by the police. The attack took place after clashes between supporters and opponents of President Evo Morales, which have been taking place since the October 20th general elections, in which Morales won re-election. Violent opposition sectors have refused to recognize his victory.
I stand with the truth and I am not afraid of speaking it. I am in a free country, and if you want to kill me for this process of change, then I am ready to give my life.
The Vice President of Bolivia, Alvaro Garcia Linera, addressed the kidnapping of the mayor in a news conference earlier.
For these people, being a woman is a crime. For these people, being humble is a crime. For these people to wear the traditional indigenous skirt is a crime. This doesn't happen in a democracy. This is called fascism. That is fascism. Attacking women, attacking them for being indigenous, humiliating them, attacking social organizations. That's fascism. What Bolivia is facing now is a wave of fascism.
In Brazil, the highly anticipated auction of drilling rights to 4 deep-sea oil fields has brought a lower bid than expected. The auction only managed to raise 17 billion against 26 billion the Brazilian government had hoped for. The amount was yet another blow to Jair Bolsonaro's far-right government, which is already struggling to revive the country's economy. The auction comes after Bolsonaro's recent push for the Latin American country to be included in the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Still to come, the impeachment process of U.S. President Donald Trump heats up. Stay with us. Welcome back. Social sectors in Honduras are raising the alarm about an executive decree that grants nearly $200 million to the military to execute an agricultural development plan.
According to the authorities of the Livestock and Agriculture Ministry, everything is ready for the military's agricultural development plan to begin operations across the whole country.
We are in coordination with the Defense Ministry, and in there we have selected some producers who are organized campesinos, and we're going to give them all the technical support.
But campesino leadership says that they were not consulted before the implementation of this plan, and that the army has no capacity to carry it out. They add that there are already government agencies in place who could handle this.
We are now faced with an enormous problem how the army will carry out the plan. If the land has its owners, if each plot has its owners, how are they going to lend to producers? How are they going to make the seed arrive? How are they going to make agricultural research arrive? These are questions that we ask ourselves.
Considering ongoing murders and repression by the army since the 2009 coup d'etat, various social sectors consider that the measure is created to strengthen the military's power in exchange of helping maintain the current government in power.
What they are doing is buying the conscience of the Armed Forces High Command and also reinforcing the already reactivated death squads, from whom we have already seen the consequences of their actions.
Budget management experts believe that the government is wasting money that the agricultural sector needs by giving it to the armed forces, who have no training to manage agriculture.
They are giving almost $200 million to an institution that has neither the capacity nor the experience nor the instruments to serve the agricultural sector.
The role assigned in the Constitution to the armed forces is to defend the integrity of the Honduran territory and its sovereignty. The budget for this plan is unknown, as it is shielded by a secrecy law under the pretext of national security affairs.
In the Caribbean, Barbados Prime Minister Mia Amour Motley says Liat Airlines is doomed if the regional carrier is only left to 4 shareholder governments to keep it afloat. She says other Caribbean nations need to chip in to sustain the airline.
What we have done is to place the burden of Liat only on the shareholders without recognizing that routes cannot be sustainable unless they're either financially profitable or economically desirable. If they are financially profitable, there is no issue, because the profit is after you have taken into account all of your payments, including the payments that governments are now paying now for the planes. If it is economically desirable, then we need to be able to have a minimum revenue guarantee such that once the load factor of particular routes falls below whatever the agreed average is, be it 65% or 63% or 60%, governments who want to sustain those routes say, I will pay the difference between the two.
House Democrats will begin public hearings next week for the first time as they continue the impeachment inquiry into United States President Donald Trump. 3 State Department officials will be the first to testify. So far, key witnesses have given sworn statements behind closed doors. Democrats are seeking to remove Trump from office on claims that he pressured Ukraine to publicly announce an investigation into political rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden.
On this vote,
the victorious South Africa national rugby team have kicked off their nationwide victory parade. The team's open tour bus brought business to a standstill in Johannesburg's Central Business District as thousands of excited fans lined up the streets to catch a glimpse of the world champions. The team will, for the next 5 days, visit the country's largest cities, including Cape Town, Durban, and Port Elizabeth. And we end in South Africa, where hundreds of investors gathered in Sandton, Johannesburg for a 3-day conference to accelerate efforts to attract investment. The nation hopes to raise $100 billion in investment over the next 5 years.
President Cyril Ramaphosa welcomed delegates to the 2nd South African Investment Conference held under the theme Accelerating Growth by Building Partnerships. The president promised potential investors that government will continue to remove hurdles to doing business in South Africa.
Through the expanding of network of Invest SA's one-stop shops, we are working to remove bureaucratic as well as administrative hurdles to investment. And this we're doing having had discussions with a number of you as investors and potential investors. We've taken steps and continue to take steps to remove all these hurdles and impediments.
Last year's conference saw pledges of over $20 billion worth of investment commitments, and this year also looks promising.
We will make the 1.2 billion trillion that the president has targeted in the next 5 years. We are quite confident we will be able to make that, so that we make, through those investments, we are able to create the much needed jobs for our young people. We are also able, through those investments, to grow our economy to respectable levels.
One of the groundbreaking investment commitments came in the automotive industry.
The Toyota company has announced that the first production of a hybrid vehicle on the African continent will take place here in South Africa. That is a combination of a car that is driven by an electric battery and petrol technologies. That's the car of the future.
The newly launched African Continental Free Area Agreement will also boost intra-African trade and create a market of around 1.3 billion people. Johan Abrams for Telesur in Johannesburg.
And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. For our viewers in Africa, remember you can find us on StarSat Channel 461 in South Africa and Channel 539 in Nigeria.